Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Andebele. I'm an assistant director in the Office of Research Excellence in the School of Public Health. On behalf of our Senior Associate Dean for Research and Innovation, Dr. Adnan Haida, I would like to welcome you all and a special welcome to all the non-GW persons joining us today. And we look forward to new institutional collaborations, of course, focusing on climate and health. Another special welcome to our colleagues from Pod 2, who directly support investigators within our School of Public Health. As the Office of Research Excellence in the School of Public Health, we are happy to partner with the Office of the Vice Provost for Research and the REACH Center, which is a new cross-institutional research center focused on climate and health. We're also happy to have Hanover Research serving as the resource persons during the event, and would like to welcome Melissa and colleagues from Hanover Research. The area of climate and health is clearly becoming an important area of focus, with various initiatives being put in place by governments and funders all over the world. In November last year, I was fortunate to attend a meeting of the Global Forum on Health Research, which was held in Malaysia, focusing on climate and health. And in that meeting, we were focusing on the ethical aspects. And I'm also happy to announce that with our colleagues at the University of Science Techniques in Bamako, we recently received a small grant from the World Health Organization focusing on climate and health, and particularly focusing on the ethical aspects within the context of Mali. So doing what we can in our small way to understand issues that relate to climate and health. And it is my hope that this event will lead to the generation of new ideas and new partnerships focusing on climate and health. So after the main presentation, we are going to go into a question and answer session. So please feel free to send in your questions and comments using the chat function even during the presentation. Let me now invite my colleague, Dr. Robert Otang, to say a few words about the REACH Center. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Paul. So my name is Robert Ortung. I'm the director of the Sustainability Research Institute here at GW, part of the Alliance for a Sustainable Future, and also with Rachel Clark, co-director of the developmental core of the new REACH Center. And Rachel and I like to just give you a quick overview of the REACH Center in the next couple of minutes, and then we'll jump right into Melissa's presentation. But the REACH Center is trying to encourage research and engagement for action on climate and health, as Paul mentioned. This is an alliance between George Washington University, Howard University, George Mason, and the Environmental Defense Fund. And this initiative is funded with a grant from the NIH, the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences in particular. And the basic idea of the REACH Center is to generate more research that brings together what we know about climate change and what we know about the health outcomes of those climate change. So it's really trying to bring together two communities who in the past haven't spoken to each other as much as they really should. And so as you can see from the lower right-hand corner of our slide, the basic idea is to work not just among academics and different types of academics, but also to reach out to the community. And the EDF has been essential in helping facilitate those interactions, and also to work with big data sets. So introducing a lot of people who might not have used those data sets in the past, but helping them to get used to doing that, and also working with people who've been using those data sets and thinking about the health outcomes of some of the things that they're seeing in terms of climate change. So the focus ultimately is looking at climate solutions, and particularly ones that promote better health and environmental justice. And so now I'll turn it over to Rachel, who can explain a little bit about what the center is doing and what it can do for you.
Thanks, Bob. Could you move to, thank you. So the center will be achieving these goals through coordination of several center cores. So Bob and I are co-directing the developmental core, which is helping to support these types of research projects and bringing together teams. And we're going to be doing this a couple of different ways, but our main focus right now is through a pilot award program that we put out an RFP out for a couple months ago. The deadline is today, but don't worry, we'll have another round in the fall. And the goal of this pilot program is to really support team building and data collection in climate and health topics that could lead to future NIH proposals. So that's, directly relevant to this training that we're having today. We're also going to have trainings, workshops, and networking events throughout the year to bring researchers together and identify future projects. The center also has two other cores, the community engagement core, which is led by EDF, which is really helping support researchers in developing community engaged projects that are responsive to both governmental and non-governmental stakeholder needs. And then the exposure assessment core, which will help, as Bob mentioned, help researchers identify and apply appropriate data sets for these types of projects. So we really are a new center. We're just getting off the ground, but this training is one of the first ones we've held to sort of introduce ourselves to you and how we can help you put together the types of proposals that could eventually lead to an NIH grant.
Thanks so much, Bob and Rachel, for briefing us about the REACH Center and also for informing us about the various partners that you are working with and pricing us on the various activities that you are implementing as part of efforts to promote activities relating to climate and health. Please allow me now to introduce our presenter, Melissa Cornish, who is a managing grants consultant with Hanover Research. So the Hanover Research is a very, very important partner for us as GW as we seek to grow our research. So over to you, Melissa.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. I am thrilled to be here. The introduction to the REACH Center was fantastic. It's great to learn all about the upcoming activities that y'all will be undertaking. So I am showing my slides and going to focus on the content at hand. I look forward to introducing you to the NIH, hopefully providing you with lots of insights, maybe even demystifying some of the National Institutes of Health, given its complexities as an organization. So I'm just keeping an eye here on the clock. We are slated to present for about 55 minutes, which will then be followed by a moderated Q&A session. As was mentioned, please feel free to use the chat box. And we will then discuss those at the end, as well as the session is being recorded, and a copy of the recording and slides will become available following today's event. So again, just by way of more formal introductions, I'm thrilled to be here on behalf of Hanover Research. My name is Melissa Cornish. I am a managing grants consultant. I've been with Hanover now for almost 8 years, and I have a sort of wealth of experience related to a number of different federal funding agencies, both including the NIH and the National Science Foundation, in addition to a number of others. My history started back in academia, where I worked across a couple of different academic research institutes who were also sort of building nascent research centers. And as a result of a number of years there, I sort of acquired the skills of grant seeking and and it has evolved. So, okay, so let's turn our attention today to sort of kick off what we are here to cover, an introduction to the National Institutes of Health, sort of getting oriented to both the organization as well as highlighting a few key funding opportunities and mechanisms. I would love to provide some tips on what it means to prepare a competitive proposal, and all the while providing a number of resources throughout today's session that can hopefully be opportunities for you to refer back to, depending on where you are in your own grant-seeking efforts. We will touch on the NIH review process and policies, especially in light of what is changing in the very near future. And then I'll close with some additional resources to consider for your own leverage, highlighting where to find policies, how to improve one's own competitiveness. So let us get started. We have a lot of ground to cover. And I just want to start really, quite frankly, by sort of situating us to the National Institutes of Health, because it really is truly a fascinating organization and institution. So we know that the NIH is the largest funder of medical research in the US, and quite frankly, for good reason. It receives well over 50,000 competitive applications each year. Not surprisingly, this number continues to grow. The NIH funds more than 300,000 researchers who represent more than 2,500 institutions across the globe, obviously ranging from universities, as we well know, medical schools, its own research facilities, and other types of research institutions. So the NIH has invested nearly 48 billion, yes, billion, in biomedical and behavioral research. And just sort of in contrast to what others may be more familiar with in terms of scope, the National Science Foundation invests just under about 10 billion annually in basic research and STEM education. Obviously, two federal agencies that are charged with very different missions and visions, but just sort of for the point of perspective. So in terms of sort of the overarching goal of the NIH, its purpose, its mission is essentially to enhance health, lengthen life, and reduce illness and disability. And if we dig into that a little bit more deeply, that sort of evolves into supporting discoveries, innovative research, the applications to ultimately protect human health, developing and maintaining human and physical resources, really to help the U.S. Improve its capability to prevent disease. Its goal is to also expand the knowledge base of medical and associated sciences, really to improve the economic well-being and ensure sort of that return on investment back into the American pipeline, and then offer the highest level of scientific integrity, as well as public accountability and responsibility of the conduct of science. So a lot to think about as we sort of dive more deeply into the NIH and its funding opportunities. So at the center of this complex sphere sits the Office of the Director. So there's a lot to focus on this slide, because that just sort of points to how complex and well-defined this organization is. So the Office of the Director is essentially responsible for overseeing the entire NIH within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And then within the director's office, there sit a number of key components, including, importantly, the Office of Extramural Research, as well as policy and communications. And then there are 27 institute centers, and now ICOs as institute centers and offices, each focusing on specific areas of biomedical and public health research. So we see here that some of them are organized by medical condition, like the National Cancer Institute, while others by body part, like the National Eye Institute. So important takeaway here is that while they all sit under the umbrella of the National Institutes of Health, they too have their own mission and director and priorities. And of these 27, 24 of them actually provide funding for research. So they obviously cover a lot of ground, but thinking back to that mission slide, there are a lot of priorities when it comes to enhancing human health and the longevity. So with all of that in mind, quite frankly, I know that was brief, but I just want to get us situated because we want to turn our attention to outlining key funding mechanisms that could be available or might be available and relevant to many of you that you are interested in learning about. And then we'll walk through a few resources where we might actually find those. But I want to sort of start at the beginning in terms of thinking about what kind of funding does the NIH actually offer, because we know that there are a number of different mechanisms. And by mechanisms, I mean that sort of form of support that's used to fund all of these different categories listed under the purpose column. So at the top of the table is the R mechanism, and probably many or most are most familiar with this type of mechanism or this type of support. This is the funding mechanism used for research. And then we move down the list and we see the Ks. These are programs for career development, ranging from those who are looking for early stage investigator support or more established researchers, maybe someone who's looking to shift their focus in their own career. They certainly cover a number of different opportunities related to mentorship support, research science development, patient-oriented research, and so on. And then we have the TNF series, which are for training and fellowships. The Ts provide support for institutional training programs and are generally focused on graduate student support, postdocs, and fellows, while the F series are those that provide support for research training of individuals themselves. So maybe an MD, PhD fellowship or support for a predoctoral student who's conducting dissertation research. And then the P series, the program, project, and center grants. So one of the mechanism behind the Reach Center are the P series are those larger research projects that are program, project, or center type grants, likely involving multidisciplinary teams working across maybe a group of related projects, quite possibly multi-institutional as well, working to strive some sort of address some complex program, and obviously needing a collaborative team to do so. We move on down the list to the U mechanism, which is a mechanism that represents cooperative agreement type opportunities. And so that means that the NIH actually has a substantial engagement in the project. So their staff is providing some type of guidance or even some type of coordination, very involved throughout the duration of the project. And the U series typically support large-scale research programs or multi-site clinical trials. A well-known one that comes to mind is the Clinical and Translational Science Award Program, supported by the National Center for Advancing Translational Science. And then this other component are those that fall into buckets like resource grants or trans NIH programs, as well as a whole host of others. So this is sort of organizationally step one to sort of figure out what the NIH can provide in terms of funding support. Before we dive more deeply into some of the classic research mechanisms, the classic research project types within the R mechanism, I just want to highlight for those who are newer to the NIH, this might be slightly different from other sponsors, and building on what the mechanism means. These sort of 3-character activity codes, these R01, R03 are called activity codes, and they differentiate across a wide variety of programs that the NIH supports. So obviously the first character identifying the major mechanism or program type, in this instance, the R for research, and then it's usually followed by 2 numbers or a number and a letter signifying some other detail of the code. So quite honestly, although these codes are sort of broadly defined in purpose, there of course might be differences across institutes and centers. As we know, they have their own mission and director and organizational structure. So important to point out some of those finer details. But let's take a closer look at the research award types outlined on this slide. Again, this is just a summary of sort of high-level characteristics, but I will say this probably a couple of times this morning. it's really so important to dive into the details when you get to the point of selecting an opportunity that you want to pursue, because understanding the differences are really absolutely critical when there could be unique differences, even though they might fall under that common name R01 or R03 and so on. So I'll stress that a few times. So the R01 is probably the most well-known, substantial, prestigious, as well as the oldest activity code at the NIH. It is available through all of the institutes and centers, generally provides support for 3 to 5 years for an independent investigator. Preliminary data in an application are traditionally expected, as well as some history of previously funded research. And the R01, the parent R01, is renewable after the initial project period. The R03 is a much smaller opportunity that traditionally supports projects that are, pilot studies or secondary analyses, maybe some type of descriptive study. Much smaller in duration in terms of offering support for 1 to 2 years, and only up to $50,000 per year in direct cost. This opportunity is not renewable, and in many instances does not require any preliminary data in the application. And then the next one, the R21, probably also sort of well-known right behind the R01, is traditionally considered funding for high-risk, high-reward studies that are somewhat exploratory and developmental in nature and need only 2 years or up to 2 years of funding support, up to $275,000 in total direct costs for the project period, with no more than $200,000 in any year. While these applications typically don't require preliminary data, we also do recognize that a majority of those that end up being funded actually do tend to include it. So if you have it, you certainly want to include it and use it to your advantage to position your application for reviewers to see sort of how feasible and how prepared you are. And then there's this last column, the R35. It is specific to only a handful of institutes. And rather than supporting sort of a discrete project, it is an opportunity to present a research program or work in a lab. And that doesn't necessarily have specified aims, but is a longer term sort of program to build this outstanding investigator type of award for longer term support. And depending upon the solicitation, may be available for an early stage investigator or a more experienced one. So I now have used this reference to early stage investigator a few times, so I definitely want to pause here for just a moment and touch on the importance of these types of designations. An early stage investigator is one who has never been awarded an R01 or its equivalent and earned their terminal degree within the last 10 years or finished their post-grad clinical training. The key here is that they have never previously successfully competed as a PI for the NIH Independent Research Award. And I include this link here just to share as a resource for anyone who's interested in checking to see what grants actually don't remove this type of eligibility. There are many. And the sort of importance of the distinction of being an early stage investigator is, quite frankly, the opportunity where some programs actually give early stage investigators sort of special consideration during the review period, in that those who are deemed early stage will likely or may likely be clustered together so that their review sits outside of those who are more seasoned and experienced investigators, and their scores may be prioritized for funding as a result of that designation. And then a new investigator, for another terminology, is one who has not previously received substantial independent funding from the NIH, and there are certainly a number of opportunities available through different institutes and centers that are specifically targeted for new investigators. So just wanted to get us further situated. So there are so many opportunities, so many programs, and obviously so many nuances. I hope I've sort of given you a very small taste of those. and how these mechanism types then translate into actual announcements or notices of funding opportunities. For those who love a good acronym, we like to refer to these as NOFOs. The NOFOs represent the announcements used by the NIH, previously called FOAs or funding opportunity announcements, for anyone who's familiar with that term. And these are essentially the announcements inviting researchers and applicants to submit their grant application. Obviously, the NOFO has a number of important details contained in it, usually many pages, outlining sort of the specific goals of the program, the purpose of the opportunity, obviously the funding mechanism that's being used, requirements of eligibility, both for the institution and for the PI, maybe as well as other staff, application instructions, review criteria, both the standard review criteria as well as any additional review criteria that need to be considered. And they take the shape of sort of these three as seen on the left-hand side. So we have parent announcements, program announcements, and requests for applications. The parent announcements are quite broad. They let applicants submit the investigator-initiated, sort of that unsolicited call for research ideas to a specific activity code like the R01 or the R21. We often hear people refer to the R01 as I submitted it to the parent. So that's the parent announcement, which is the NOFO for the R01. Most institutes and centers participate. And for those that are parents, they are generally accepted 3 times a year, February-ish, June-ish, and October. Of course, they very well could vary depending upon the activity code that you're targeting. They are centrally managed and broadly issued. Typically, they are re-released every 3 years or so. Of course, if there's some type of important policy update, they could be released on a different cycle. So the second type, program announcements, are those that are issued by one or more institute center office to highlight some specific scientific interest area and could encourage applications for a new or an ongoing program. So sort of a little bit more defined than that broad announcement of a parent. And then within the program announcements, there are 2 types: those that have set aside funds already for this particular opportunity, or those that have some special designation regarding the receipt, referral, or review considerations known as a PAR. So a PAS and a PAR. And then the last type, the request for applications, are typically accepted only on a single due date. It's a NOFO issued, again, by one or more institute center office to really highlight some well-defined area of scientific interest, some key priority area that has to accomplish a specific program objective. These are for the more targeted NIH requested type research projects. There could be some set aside funds and an anticipated number of awards for those. So again, different types of announcement that do mean different things. A notice of special interest, another acronym to add to our box, is the NOCI. It's not a type of a NOFO, but it's actually an expanded opportunity. Once referred to child notices that might be familiar to some. They too are published in the NIH Guide for Grants and Contracts. These are notices that are essentially a statement of scientific priority that encourage applicants to apply to this NOCI using a particular NOFO as its conduit. So oftentimes linked to some type of parent NOFO. So it's acceptable for the parent R01, the parent R21, and so on. And it consists of some specific topic of scientific interest for the sponsoring institute. I just saw one late yesterday related to Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Just as an example, I offer a sample here at the bottom for the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. And these notices really do designate the NOFOs that are allowed to use them for the application submission, which one would note in their application form as well as within the narrative. The NOC doesn't necessarily, or I should say, doesn't generally include sort of the administrative type details that one finds, as we would expect that level of detail to be enclosed in the NOFO. Okay, so many different types of opportunities out there. And for someone who's not quite sure where to look, I would certainly recommend grants.gov as a great first place to stop in your own search. This is the repository of all things federal. Every single funding opportunity that the federal government puts out there has to be posted in grants.gov. Incredible, powerful repository. One that has many different purposes. And for today, we're going to speak specifically to how to search for funding opportunities. But please note that when you go to grants.gov homepage, you can see so many other uses for this incredible system. So I kept it simple for today's purpose, but just as an example, I'm searching here for just basically R01. So that's my simple keyword. I want to see all those opportunities that are forecasted and posted. And in return, I get this long listing of results. And I did specify that I just wanted to see the NIH opportunities. And so here I can see that there's these opportunity numbers, which tell me a little something. As we know, the NOT is notice. The PAR is that program announcement with receipt referral. And so we can click on that and get more information into the specific opportunity, or use this sort of high level executive summary just to sort of, start fishing and see what's out there. So everything has an opportunity title. I can see here that it's either forecasted or posted. So forecasted means it's coming soon, but as we can see in this first row, it's not necessarily a surprise that they don't always get posted when they are forecasted. So oftentimes I find myself looking for an opportunity that I know that's coming out and referring back to grants.gov to see if there's been any announcement. And then we have here the posted as well as the close date. So we certainly want to note when it closes when we're thinking about planning for our own grant seeking. If it's going to close in just a couple of weeks, then it's not likely that it's an opportunity that makes sense to invest time and effort in. So as an additional sort of another layer of searching, and I have to say this sponsor database, grants.nih.gov, is really rising to the top as one of my new favorites because it recently underwent a major overhaul, and I find it to be so much easier to use and really incredibly informative. So we can search funding opportunities or other notices. Simply put, you can add as many sort of filters as you want to your search. For this instance, I simply searched on climate as my keyword just to see what comes back. And I did this just yesterday, so this is very current. And again, it gives me sort of high level information. I can click on it. So this hyperlink actually takes me to the NOFO. If it's one that I'm going to select, I will likely download it and, read it a dozen times. So it gives me enough information here sort of just to wet my whistle and figure out if I want to keep reading and pursue anything further. And then here I highlight here on the next slide that I clicked this tab for other notices, and I specifically chose just those that were notices of special interest or NOCs, again with my keyword climate, again within the NIH, because you can specify it to the institute and center, but I was looking across the entire organization. And I see that I end up with 3 results, all related to climate. I do like the feature here because not only can I see who's the issuing organization, but I also can see who's participating in it. And so that's really insightful for me to see that, there's a number of institutes participating in these particular notices, which would make it very relevant for me if I was going to attach something like this to a parent R01 or a parent R21. So two fantastic resources to familiarize yourself if you're getting started and looking for those funding opportunities. So once you get to sort of the stage where you think you might have some sense of what funding opportunity you want to pursue, it's sort of a question, you know, where do I start? Where should I look first? Obviously, there's so many places to look, but really a good place to start, especially if you are very new to this, a good place to start is to get to know sort of what's already been funded in your area. And if you are someone who has applied to the National Science Foundation previously, I'm sure you've done this as well with their database of information, which is also pretty powerful. But sort of finding out what's been funded that's related to my scientific interest, to my project concept, the NIH Research Portfolio Online Reporting Tool, otherwise known as REPORT, is another fantastic repository of a wealth of information related to sort of all things NIH supported research activities, supported work, publications, expenditures. It's an opportunity that the NIH set out to sort of gather everything and put it in one place, and then make all of these data easily accessible to the public. And so here, I just simply start off with a quick search. So asking Reporter to tell me what is actually available in this one particular area. Within Reporter, there's also a fantastic resource where I can look for potential program officers or officials, more formally known as, who might be working in an area of research that my project idea could potentially fit into in their portfolio. And it would give me insight as I think about, you know, what the right fit is and what the potential program might be. So by using this resource, this platform, it's an opportunity to start asking questions like, not only what is the NIH funding, but what types of results came out of these projects? Is there an opportunity to align with this previously funded work? Are there specific programs that look like they're funding the type of work that I'm interested in pursuing? Is there an opportunity to potentially identify a prospective collaborator, or what institution elsewhere in the country is doing this type of research? So I would certainly urge you to take some time and spend some time familiarizing yourself with all that is available in this single site. So for this screenshot, I'm sort of providing an example of how to use Matchmaker. With this open text box at the top, I used content from a publicly available NIH funded project just to show you how it provides results. But with this very sort of simple, small amount of text, in return, I can see that there are certain institutes and centers that are interested in this type of work, or that have funded this type of work, what types of activity codes are supporting it, what study sections have reviewed it. And then I can go in a little bit further and actually identify those program officials who are linked now to these funded projects. So extremely rich detail, and could be used for a number of different purposes. So after you have, started to weigh your options, maybe you're at the point where you're considering some relevant NOFOs, and now you're sort of, facing a decision as to which direction you should head, or you've even potentially selected a good one. I want to sort of just offer you some details in terms of thinking about how to get organized and really how to get started after you've done your homework and you've started to collect all of that important intelligence. So first things first, when you're ready to begin and you're to the point of identifying that funding opportunity, I urge you to read through all of the competition materials. That would include the NOFO, the NOC, definitely the application guide that the NIH puts out, especially if you're new or it's been a while, or quite frankly, just to serve as a refresher, because there is so much rich detail that one needs to know when you're getting ready to prepare and submit an application. Identify all of the required application elements, and I I am a big fan of checklists. Create a checklist, start to itemize all the elements that need to go into the application. And I actually like to refer to it as the application package, because it really is a package of content, a package of requirements. Most definitely note all of the timelines and deadlines, and then use those to create yourself a grant development plan that actually includes a timeline, so that you as the PI and you as sort of the project manager puts together for not only yourself, but also for those who are collaborating with you, those who are helping you review, understanding what sort of time you have to lay out all of these very important details, and even work backwards from several days before the actual deadline to figure out how much time you can allocate to each component of this application. And then start sort of thinking about drafting the Ames page. Maybe you're at the place of conceptualization, or you're starting to, flesh it out. Look back at the application guide to understand what the requirements of an Ames page look like. And that will certainly be an iterative process, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. And then create a narrative outline. So as we know from other funding agencies like the National Science Foundation, there are some very specific details that need to be included in an application that's compliant against all of the review criteria that the application will be reviewed against. And so while you're getting organized and getting started, it's a really worthwhile endeavor to carve out the time to actually set that up for yourself, so that you know sort of now rather than later at the 11th hour that you have all of those requirements in your so-called template, and it's set to the requirements of the organization, of the NIH specifically, because no surprise, there are many, and they need to be followed. And then start gathering the required information. There will be a lot. I'll show you a checklist on the next page. And all the while, I would certainly recommend that you reach out to those who work with your sponsored programs office to really understand what they need from you and sort of what their timelines look like, so that you can build that into your plan as well. So I know that this is no small undertaking. I put together this checklist just sort of as an example. Certainly it needs to be vetted against an actual no phone application guide, but this is just an example of the breadth and number of details that are needed. And sort of implicitly highlighted here is hinting at why starting early is so critical in putting together an application package that we hope will become competitive. So if you're thinking, if you're sort of at the stage now where you're thinking about, what does an Ames page look like, or what should my Ames page include? What does the research strategy consist of? I just wanted to touch on this very briefly for the sake of talking about the importance of putting together a competitive application. So the Ames page is often one of the most closely read pages of an NIH proposal. It's used by the scientific review officer to make study section and reviewer decisions, so that's important. And it really is the best place to start one's proposal. Taking the time and the iteration to develop it is really critical, because the Ames page has such a big role in all different places of the application development process as well as the review process. So the Ames page is, it needs to persuade reviewers that the project is important, for one. It also is an opportunity to convey that you have the right team to do the proposed work. It's an important opportunity to convey in this single page that your research is going to be some logical next step in advancing your field, a program, and that by completing it, this project, when funded, when complete, is actually going to help the NIH achieve its mission, and the institute or center achieve its mission and advance the science that is ultimately intended to advance and enhance public human health. So no small job there. Quite frankly, ultimately you want to write the Ames page in a somewhat non-technical style, so that all study section members can read it and understand it. And it's also important to make sure that it consists of the most important and exciting details about your project. But obviously the trick is doing so within only a single page. So from there, though, having that really sort of an engaging specific aims page, hooking in the reviewers, the goal is to convince them to keep reading. And so that is where we want to take them. We want them to keep reading the research strategy, which is the descriptive narrative, ultimately the proposal that comes immediately after the aims page. And we want those aims to be so compelling that they will keep reading and they will be enthusiastic because you sort of lured them in and you did a great job doing so. Depending upon the program and the activity code, the research strategy could be 6 or 12 pages long. Certainly an important detail to note early on when you're getting yourself organized. And regardless of the length, however, the research strategy for a research project grant typically requires just a section on significance, innovation, and approach, and those are not to be modified. Occasionally, of course, depending upon the mechanism, there might be some deviation to this, but in most instances, this is pretty classically the outline of a research strategy. So really, quite frankly, it's an opportunity to convey your enthusiasm, to write cogently, and keep the reviewers engaged so that they see your excitement and the potential impact for the project. So some keys to success. Important to talk to a program officer about your ideas early on. I highly recommend against contacting any program officer within a month of the deadline. That's probably not going to bode well for you. They might not even respond, but certainly several months in advance, if you're thinking about and you're planning ahead. It's an opportunity to also share a draft aims page. Certainly, it doesn't need to be perfect. It should be more than just a couple of bullets. It should be the sort of, a iteration of a full page, one that's probably already gone through a couple of reviews with colleagues and peers. And most definitely review all of these additional resources that I've suggested. There's so much out there to learn and absorb. Thinking about your own timing, again, start early, plan ahead, create yourself a timeline. Strive to have a first full draft of your proposal 6 to 12 weeks before the deadline. So then you can work in plenty of time for iteration and feedback from different types of individuals. Ask for feedback at different stages of your grant development process, at the conceptualization stage, at the first draft of an aims page, maybe following the conversation with a program officer to talk about how their feedback will influence, what's next for you. Carve out plenty of time for revising. Submit early. I urge you, submit early. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, we recommend submitting as early as 5 to 7 business days in advance. Of course, that calendar might be dictated by the office that's helping you submit and what their requirements are. But if you submit early, there could be a chance that if you miss something and you fall within the window that you can go back and correct it. And then also remembering that if your application is not funded, there's an opportunity to receive, there will be a summary statement returned in response to your application and the findings of the study section. And it's an opportunity to not only engage with the program officer again, but also to consider all that you can learn from those reviewers and then potentially include that in a resubmission or think about how you might position yourself differently in your next new submission. So I know there's a lot to take in. I want to touch on the proposal review process in an effort to sort of keep in line here with developing a competitive proposal. I know that there's a tremendous amount of time that's invested in putting together a proposal that we hope is responsive, competitive, and one of the sort of best evidence of all that you are capable of. And so we are sort of thinking about here, so now that you've actually submitted it and maybe you can catch your breath for a moment, thinking about sort of where does it go? So starting here at the top left of this graphic, after the application is received, the Division of Receipt and Referral within the Center for Scientific Review essentially checks it for all those components of completeness, compliance, and decides where it should be assigned for potential funding. And so which institute or center is essentially going to get it. And this is why starting early is so important, because this is the idea of completeness and compliance is obviously a very important process in the review process, and sort of knowing who your audience is speaks to ensuring that what you're preparing is complete and thorough and abides by all of the rules in the application guide. So your application will receive an identification number, and then it will get assigned to a specific study section, more formally known as a scientific review group. So I'm going to sort of take a pause here and just say that at the time of your application submission, you have an opportunity to actually recommend on a form that goes with the application what study section or study sections might be the most appropriate to review your application process. To review your application during the review process. And so I would certainly urge you to consider this, because you can simply put in your title in the assisted referral tool, the title of your proposal, and a few sentences of content in the open text box. And in return, you'll end up with a few study sections. And if they are sort of strong or moderately aligned with the topic of the content that you've included here. And that's an opportunity to then take that information, review it closely, understand sort of who sits on the study section roster, maybe have a conversation with the program officer, and then consider how you might use this optional form to suggest to the scientific review officer whom you might like to have actually review your proposal. Again, it's just a suggestion, but I just heard recently that many applicants don't actually take advantage of this opportunity, but it could be, really some great consideration that the scientific review officer might they certainly might consider very seriously that there are specific areas of alignment where knowing your research topic best, take advantage of this as an opportunity. So, okay, back to the review process. Sorry for that little deviation. Your proposal will get assigned to a specific study section, scientific review group, in addition to a scientific review officer and a program officer. And this study section is ultimately the group who will evaluate the scientific and technical merit and overall impact of your application. So this process will obviously also address details like human subject protection, and the scientific review officer is the one who manages all of this. And so essentially, there's two levels of review when we think about the review process, aside from the compliance and completeness checks that happened in the beginning. So the first level of review is quite frankly, the traditional peer review undertaken by the study section that's now been assigned to review your proposal. It's tasked with identifying and evaluating the scientific and technical merit, and then providing an overall impact score, or ultimately the likelihood that this project, this proposal, will exert some type of sustained, quote unquote, sustained powerful influence on the research field involved. And so just for those who might be curious, the study sections are comprised mainly of non-federal scientists recruited for their expertise. The study sections are intended to be a balanced representation across all different groups, as well as represent stature in the field with a range of different type of expertise and experiences. So Each application is assigned at least 3 reviewers for their in-depth review. And so, which they then undertake, and then they provide a written critique as well as a preliminary criterion scores before the meeting of the entire review group. And this sort of usually drives what are the top half of the applications, approximately the top half of the applications that then are going to be discussed during the review meeting. And so for anyone who's familiar with the designations, if the summary statement comes back as an ND, it means it wasn't discussed, it was deemed less meritorious from those preliminary scores that were sent in, but you will still get a summary statement of the written feedback from the individuals who initially reviewed it. So at the time of the review meeting, the 3 or more reviewers who were assigned to your proposal will present the strengths and weaknesses of your application. And those who are eligible members of the study section and don't have conflicts of interest will then participate in a discussion about the application. And your assigned reviewers will then provide a final score, and all of members of the review group will provide their scores privately. So knowing your audience is important, because those who are all providing scores didn't necessarily read it from cover to cover. And so again, important to make sure that your messaging and your impact is clearly articulated against the criteria that are used to provide scores, as these 5 review criteria are those that are scored across the application. And so the scoring range is 1 to 9, 1 being the highest, 9 being the lowest, so the reverse of what we would think or what we would expect. Again, the lower the score, the better results of your review. And then from that, an impact score is determined as sort of an average of the individual review criteria. Excuse me, not an average. The impact score is not an average of the individual review criteria as a result of a number of factors that go into it overall. So that's a very common question that we do get. So these 5 criteria, significance, investigator, innovation, approach, and environment, are those classically used for research grants. And of course, there could be additional criteria that the NOFO has pointed out to that we certainly want to be aware of. And then after that meeting, all of the reviewed applications receive that overall impact score and that summary statement that's prepared by the scientific review officer, returned to the applicant shortly thereafter the meeting. So the score comes within 3 business days, and then the summary statement usually about 4 to 8 weeks or so afterwards. And we'll talk about the second level of review in just a few minutes. So after the review meeting, maybe let's say you've received a score and a summary statement, you might be asked to provide just-in-time information that could enhance the review and clarify details that might need clarifying. At this point, your contact becomes the program officer. And for some, of course, depending upon what the summary statement says, for some, this could be sort of the place in the road where an individual decides that they saw their summary statement, they're not going to be funded based on their score, but it could be an opportunity to resubmit. It's certainly an opportunity to reevaluate. Maybe it's time to direct attention elsewhere. Maybe the reviewer's comments address enough that it's a consideration for applying for a new application altogether. So certainly sort of that fork in the road, or a number of forks in the road. So the second level of review that I referenced a few minutes ago means that it moves to the National Advisory Council, and that is the group that the NIH relies on and is comprised of basic research scientists, clinical scientists, public representatives, just a whole host of individuals. It's at this stage that recommendations are made to fund or not fund applications, and ultimately that decision resides with the institute or center director. And so these decisions, quite honestly, are made based on a number of different considerations, important ones like the priority, the current priorities, the mission of the institute that would be funding it, congressional mandates, maybe the availability of funding, obviously a big one, and then what the recommendations that the program staff and advisory council provided. So obviously, a lot goes into the review process. And one sort of important change that I want to point out, especially when we think about research project grants, is that the main criteria that I just mentioned, significance, investigator, innovation, approach, environment, that are all scored, are based on that 1 to 9 scale, have been traditionally used, but over the course of really a couple of years, the NIH has worked to simplify this review framework. And this is extremely timely because this new framework is going into effect for any research project grants submitted on or after January 25th. So in just a few days, this will go into place. And this new framework will impact activity codes like the R01, the R03, the R21. And so anything that's submitted for that standard deadline in February will then be reviewed over the summer months. And so that's when this will all be implemented. So sort of in summary, the purpose of these changes is to address, really address a number of complexities associated with the peer review process. The traditional 5 criteria have been reworked into 3 factors. And so factor 1 really pointing to the importance of the research, which will include now the significance and innovation of the proposal, again, scored 1 to 9. And it will essentially, the reviewer will ask, should this project be done through this factor? And then factor 2 is for the rigor and feasibility of the proposal. Can it be done? And so this will point to the approach as well as some details related to human subjects and the clinical trials study timeline. And then the third factor will point to the investigators and environment, and reviewers will determine, will the project be done? Does the project have all of the right, the right team, the right environment, the right resources in place? And are there needs for additional expertise or resources? This factor won't actually be scored. And so there's obviously a lot sort of to take in here, but it's ultimately simplifying what has been classically used, and will be an opportunity for reviewers to be trained in the spring so that it can be implemented in the summer. And really, quite frankly, from all that we've learned about it, there is sort of little impact that this should have on an application itself, because the requirements of the applications are not changing. Obviously, we want to emphasize the importance of making sure that you're reading the most current NOFO, making sure the NOFOs were re-released with this new simplified criteria. So we certainly want to refer to the latest one. And by latest, I mean some of those that have just been released in the last couple of weeks. And then also making sure that you're using the most current forms because the application guide has been updated. So important details, but also remembering that your audience is still the reviewers, the study section, the overarching framework that is being reorganized with the outcome, and hope that it is more simplified for reviewers who have been working in this area for a long time. So there's lots of resources out there. It will be interesting it will actually be really exciting to see sort of when the first round of summary statements get released in the summer months or early fall, I should say, sort of what the results look like once this becomes implemented. So I know we've covered a lot today, and I hope that it has been helpful. I know that there's so much to learn, there's so much to absorb. I hope that some of this has provided you with new insights into the NIH, as I mentioned at the beginning, maybe even demystified this complex organization a little. I want to close with just a few more resources that are available to us, that are publicly available on the NIH website, and really urge you that when your time allows, to take advantage of them. This is by no means exhaustive, but some good ones that I look at on a regular basis. So Open Mic is a blog written by the Deputy Director for Extramural Research, easy to subscribe to. Usually very timely with, changes or policy updates. A good one to check out. The Early Career Reviewer Program is an awesome opportunity for someone who really wants to get a bird's eye view into the review process. There are a number of application requirements, a great opportunity to actually serve as a reviewer, sort of sit side by side and learn not only about the process, but also about those applications that are incredibly competitive. And then I close here with a few more links. Some of these are in response to a couple of questions that were asked at the time of registration, but I offer those here for you to check out at your own leisure. The Grants Learning Center is an opportunity that our team has created with sort of an on-demand asynchronous learning style. And within this, we have an NIH module intended to be interactive, as well as offering sort of a step-by-step guide to developing an aims page as well as a research strategy. And so that's available as well. So with that, I am going to pause, and I know we're moving into the moderated Q&A section before we get to closing remarks by Dr. Erkins. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for taking us through this session and for sharing all these resources. So as I mentioned, please feel free to write down your questions in the chat box. As I was listening to this presentation, I thought it was a very, very good refresher for those with experience with the NIH processes. But for me, I serve also as a reviewer for the NIH, and at least I was grabbing some very, very important tips. And importantly, for those of us who are new to the NIH processes, you shared lots of resources, and you also clearly explained how we can actually use those resources so that we find answers to some of our questions. Importantly, also, you apprised us on some of these codes that are commonly used, this language of codes that are commonly used when you're looking at all these funding opportunities. And you also looked at the issue of early stage researchers, new investigators, and all that. And I'm happy that we've got some of our doctoral students who are here right now. So at least they grab something about the opportunities that are available to them. So now we're getting into the Q&A session. Please feel free to send in your questions and comments through the chat function. So we're going to coordinate this part of this event with Robert. So I'll just start off, and then I'll hand over to Robert. But Melissa, you mentioned about calls that have many centers and institutes. What can investigators do to ensure that they catch the eyes of the centers? Because I know in some of the situations, even if you're not on the list of those that are not supposed to be funded, you actually find a center or an institute actually stepping up and saying, we want to fund this particular application.
It's a great question. So I would suggest, you can take it from a couple of different directions. So if you are looking if you're starting out and just diving in to find a funding opportunity, every funding opportunity has the sponsoring institute at the very top, in addition to the participating institutes. And those participating institutes could be, few in number, or there could be sort of 23 of them that are participating. And so thinking about what your area of interest and area of expertise is, you could certainly sit across different types of institutes, but that's one place to look and to really sort of dive into the details. And the other is if you are just sort of evaluating the different institutes that make up the NIH, you know, take the time and actually go back to each institute's website. They all have them. It's an opportunity to dive more deeply into their strategic plan. It's an opportunity to see what their public-facing priorities are. It's also an opportunity to go into the NIH reporter, and if you have an institute or two in mind, you can certainly search by institute name and see what they have funded in the last fiscal year, the last 5 years. So you can get at that type of more detailed information in a number of different ways. And you can certainly take the time to, sort of start small, flag a couple that sound like they might be relevant and aligned to your area of interest. And use all of that public facing information in that repository to dive in more deeply.
Thank you, Robert.
Yeah, I think Ali, I don't know if you still have a question. I see your hand is up. Well, one question was answered in the chat, which is that the slides will be available.
Yes.
Probably one for all. And then, okay, so we have a second question here, and I wanted to bring a more general context. As a first timer, what are the most obvious pitfalls that we should be aware of? And just sort of thinking about that, but also in the context of perhaps people who are working on climate issues and then thinking about how to add a health component in. I don't know if you have, Melissa, if you had any thoughts on what would be a good strategy for thinking that aspect of it through.
So certainly not unlike the question from Dr. Paul, an opportunity to sort of read and familiarize yourself with what the NIH funding priorities are, and then obviously at a more specific level, the institute in particular, and looking at those notices of funding opportunities, and some of them being quite broad, as well as potentially identifying a program officer who has maybe been linked with one or a similar program in the past related to climate and health, could also be a great opportunity to start with in terms of having a conversation. There are many sort of webinars, webinars related to a particular program, webinars related to the overall institute, and sort of an annual session. And so those could also be ones where you start to pay a little bit more closely attention to, what the topics are on their upcoming agendas as well. So I think you can take it from a number of different approaches, whether it's at the institute level to identify priorities, at the funding opportunity level to identify sort of greater, more granular detail, and then look to see what's already been funded just in the last year alone could be quite telling. And should I answer that question about the pitfalls, most obvious pitfalls? Okay. So there is a lot to that comment or question. What are the most obvious pitfalls that we should be aware of? The sort of two that come to, maybe three, I could think of probably 30, but the top ones that come to mind, quite frankly, are not taking the time and preparing yourself as a grant seeker, not familiarizing yourself with all of the material that's out there, just, before you even get to the competition stage, but really understanding the priorities, like how you align with a particular institute, a particular funding opportunity, and doing your homework. So those who rush it, those who are trying to pull this off at the 11th hour, somebody who puts together a sloppy application, an application that's non-compliant or incomplete, it's not going to get past that first preliminary level of the Division of Receipt and Referral. And if it's sloppy and incomplete, if it does get to the review stage, if it does get to the study section, the reviewers are going to see that, you know, it's not your best foot forward. It's not going to be a reflection of all that you really are capable of. So a pitfall being not giving yourself enough lead time in addition to not doing all of your homework to even get to that point. And so quite frankly, when I said a few times, you know, start early, by starting early, I actually mean start months in advance. It is going to take a lot of time just getting up and running, you know, figuring out where the right information is, reading through the application guide, even though it's, you know, a fairly dense reference document, it provides some pretty pertinent information if you've never been an NIH applicant before. And I have to say, an additional pitfall in thinking about where maybe some of your efforts and your attention at an individual level have gone towards other agencies. Some people, I think, do think, oh, well, I've already applied to this other funding agency, so I can totally just repurpose my proposal and send it in. And quite frankly, it's not going to end well, because as we would expect, as we do expect, there are different rules and regulations and policies for, you know, the expectations of a particular funder. So an NSF proposal that is traditionally 15 pages in length is not going to look like an NIH research strategy, because there are some very different requirements of what goes in each. So I know that is a very long answer, but there are some very obvious pitfalls that are important to consider. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you. Ali, you had your hand up. Ali, do you have a question?
No, actually, I just asked my question. I'm just wondering if I can have access to the slides, which you kindly answered that yes.
Okay, wonderful.
Thank you.
So thanks, Melissa. You emphasized on the issue of ensuring that people plan ahead of time. And here we've got our colleagues from Pod 2 who actually work with investigators with Erin and also Rita. So I'm going to provide an opportunity for one of them just to talk about these things from a practical perspective in terms of the internal deadlines that they expect.
Excellent.
Rita, Erin.
Good morning.
Go ahead, Erin, go ahead. That's your
So
domain.
I don't know if the audience is all SPH or if they're if it's a broader group, but every school is assigned to a pod. For SPH, we're pod 2. And once you've we're more on the ground. So Melissa gave a lot of that, you know, sort of higher level, looking for which opportunity is right for you. But as soon as you identify the one you do want to apply to, please engage with your pod right away. I will post, we have an intent to submit form. I'll post that in the chat. We are not only here to help you, but you have to work with us to submit a sponsored project proposal. And we work with a lot of NIH. So for example, the checklist that Melissa showed you, we can build that for you. We can show you, we will build your proposal in my research. We can get you show you what the printout will look like. So we're really working hand in hand with you to build your budget, and work with any collaborators outside of GW. We're going to help you get all of that in place. So the sooner you reach out to us, the sooner we can get started. In terms of a timetable, we work backwards from your due date. No one wants to go down to the deadline. OSP has a 5 business day rule. So if we're in January right now, let's say your deadline was January 31st, we need to route an internal package for OSP to review by the 23rd. Now that means you can still have some draft science, but you need to be working with your pod member and not getting them your documents at the end of the day on the 23rd, but it takes time to get everything into the system. Your budget numbers, especially if you have human subjects, there's some manual, data entry into my research in addition to the document uploads. OSP works very quickly to complete the reviews, but we also want to be aware that the entire university, every application is funneling into OSP. So for those big NIH deadlines, February 5th, we've got one coming up. You may be done with your final documents, but it's going into the queue, the university-wide queue. So that's something we try to be aware of. And so the pod will be here to help try to keep us all on track and on schedule to get everything submitted.
Thanks, Erin. So that's from the ground, right? So you hear about issues of deadlines. Thank you very much, Robert.
Probably if there's no more questions, we could just go to the conclusion, unless anybody wanted to ask a last-minute question.
Okay, so let me just touch on one resource that I think we can also add, because here we've got people that fit the classification of early stage researchers. So for the category, that category of early stage researchers, we also have internal resources that can support them as they prepare their proposals. Timmy, would you like to touch briefly on the Mentor Match Award?
So great. I'm going to speak for the School of Public Health. So I believe for the Mentor Match Award, what we usually tell principal investigators house at the Milken Institute School of Public Health is that they do locate a mentor outside the university or, their mentors anywhere. And of course, we go into an agreement with them where their mentors could actually help them review their proposals way before submission. And we go into a non-disclosure agreement, all of that. And so, it provides feedback to principal investigators, to either retailor their research or take, advice or feedbacks from, renowned experts in their field and, make sure that their proposals are well put together before, they submit it. So they would reach out to the Office of Research Excellence, tell us who their mentors are, would have a couple of interactions with them, go back and forth. And of course, we do provide a little bit of stipend for the mentors who are actually reviewing your proposals. So it's not like, it's a free thing, but we do provide some level of stipend to your mentors. And of course, we hope that the review works for you. And of course, you secure some funding. Thank you.
Thanks, Timmy. So I'm now going to ask Melissa for 1 minute of parting shots before we move on to Esther.
I'm sorry. Can you repeat that, Dr. Paul? One
Just
minute.
1 minute, 1 minute of parting shots, your final words.
My final words. My final words are start early, sort of be thorough, take advantage of the incredible resources that you clearly have within your reach, both at the institution as well as publicly available through the NIH. Be persistent, be thorough, and read carefully. Don't assume that you know what needs to be included until you've actually confirmed what needs to be included. There's nothing worse than learning of a colleague who has gotten so far down the road and finds out that, because of something unfortunate or incomplete, all of that work ended up, having to go by the wayside, and the next deadline is now, 3 to 6 months away. So definitely be thorough. And I think really in closing, to sort of sum it all up, don't be discouraged. There is an opportunity to learn from an application, a submission that doesn't get funded. The likelihood that it won't get funded on the very first time is quite high. And so thinking about all that you have learned from the process, from the very beginning through the submission, and then in return, with what you can glean from the summary statement, use it to your advantage. Think about all that you've learned along the way and then apply it to the next one, because grant seeking is not sort of, as many of you know, grant seeking is not an end all. It's a dynamic process. It's changing for so many reasons, professionally, personally, institutionally. There are opportunities to learn from and to build on for the next one, because as you do it, you get better and better with each opportunity. So I wish you all the best. I look forward to hearing about your progress in the coming months.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Let me now hand over to Dr. Esther Atkins from the Office of the Vice Provost for Research for a few words.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. And thank you all for attending today. We really see events such as this as really important for helping really build the capacity of our investigators to be able to pursue funding from NIH and other sponsors. Thank you, Melissa, for providing a really wonderful presentation. I think she did a really nice job of kind of helping to begin to demystify NIH, going after NIH funding. It's a very large institution with a lot of moving parts, and the place to start in terms of going after funding from NIH is to really understand the organization and all those different moving parts and pieces. And I think this session today did a really nice job of kind of helping folks kind of understand, kind of that high level kind of landscape as it relates to pursuing NIH funding. I'm Research Enhancement Officer for the Research Enhancement Unit in the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Research and Vice Provost for Research. And what we do is that we really help support folks who are interested in going after funding, whether we're talking about NIH, as we talked about today, whether we're talking about other federal sponsors, or even getting you all connected with support as it relates to going after private funding, foundation funding. In REU, we provide support for faculty in a variety of ways. For starters, we provide comprehensive research development support, really helping faculty at the very earliest stages to really think about, project ideation, thinking about team development, thinking about, maybe potential opportunities they may go after. It's really important to get that kind of very early pre-proposal upfront support, and reaching out to REU, we can kind of provide that for you. Melissa talked about the need to start early. Well, one of those actions that you need to do as a part of starting early is to reach out to REU so that we can provide you all with support. We assist with identifying funding opportunities, whether we're, there are mechanisms that we're aware of based on understanding what your research is. You may have some opportunity that you've identified that you want to come and talk to us about. We work with partners such as Hanover to maybe think about building roadmaps that provide kind of a range of funding opportunities that would support your research. And so we can assist with that. We also get folks hooked up with accounts on Pivot, which is our funding opportunity database that you can use to search on your own. Another resource that we have at our disposal is some resources that can kind of help with proposal editing. We don't write your proposal for you, but we can get you hooked in with some of our consultants that can provide some editing services. And those require reaching out to us, and we can get you plugged into that support. Next slide, please. We can work with developing specialized thematic workshops and seminars that are really critical for helping to build capacity to go after funding. This workshop today was an example of that. And so activities such as that, these trainings are really important to kind of help, folks really be in position and prepared to be able to go after funding opportunities. In addition, through REU, OVP or REU, we have seed funding programs. Like I said, we get folks hooked up with pivot accounts and other offerings that really help to support faculty who are interested in going after external funding to support their research. And so we encourage you all to reach out, next slide, early and often. You can either, for general inquiries, you can reach us at our research help or rshelp@gw.edu. Or if you want some very direct consultation, you can reach out to me directly. And my email address is listed on the slide. We look forward to hearing from you and supporting you all as you go after NIH funding or any other funding that you want, that you're interested in to help to support your research. Thank you for attending today.
Thank you very much, Esther. As we get to the end of this event, on behalf of the Office of Research Excellence, I would like to thank our presenter, Melissa, for such a wonderful presentation. This was a rich session, and thanks too for the additional resources that you have provided. We appreciate your team from Hanover Research for supporting this event. I would also like to thank the organizers and points of contact at the Rich Research Center. There's Robert and Rachel. Within the Office of the Vice Provost for Research, Esther has been working with us. And of course, at Hanover Research, we've been working with Audrey and others. And within the Office of Research Excellence, Timmy has been a big hand in getting this together. And above all, thanks to you all, the participants, for being part of this wonderful session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.